we would like to have in this session a more focused attention on the subject which we have decided to undertake. Well, we would appreciate if our two speakers, both of them are extremely eminent historians with impeccable credentials, would remain focused to the idea of this conclave, which is essentially to take stock of what has been done or said to be done in the last 1 year of this Narendra Modi government. I would first request Professor Mridula Mukherjee, who has been associated and is still associated with the Jawaharlal Nehru University for the last several decades. Professor Mukherjee to begin with.
I think we are all well aware that it is a long-term pattern on behalf of the communal forces in this country that history is their favorite stalking ground. And that for good reason, because communal ideology in India has been built. At its core is a certain understanding and version of Indian history. And if you take away that understanding, it actually falls to the ground. So they've always been interested in history, and therefore historians have also been favorite targets of these forces. And whenever governments with this communal ideology have come to power, we often joke amongst ourselves that we are back in business and have a lot to do, no time to relax. So I think I'd like to maybe recount for you, I'm sure all of you have been reading about this in the newspapers, etc., but just to put it all together, I'd divide the interventions that have been made in this field into two broad categories, though overlapping. One, I look at broadly the ideological political sphere, and secondly, the institutional sphere. At the level of the ideological sphere, I think, though at the national level we are still waiting, NCRT director is being changed, the older one was pushed out, and they are getting the act together to make the interventions. But at the regional level, certainly the signs of what is going to come have already happened. In Gujarat, in Rajasthan, in Haryana, changes in textbooks and putting out books by the famous Dinanath Batra, who writes on a host of subjects where there is no gap between mythology and history. The two seamlessly flow into each other and overlap so that you don't know what you're talking about. And obviously our Prime Minister takes him very seriously, because as we all know, he even repeated and added some bit of its own in a famous inauguration of a hospital in Bombay, where he talked about the ancient Indian expertise in the area of plastic surgery, and giving the example of Ganesha as the final proof that, a head of an elephant could be transplanted onto a human being. What greater proof do you need than that ancient Indians were indeed very adept in all sciences, including the medical sciences. So that's one level of intervention which is going on. Not enough reported, not enough investigated, and I would say these are areas where we need a lot more documentation. But they are far away from the eyes of the journalists, etc. We only get to know, I think, a very little part of what's actually going on at the ground level. We keep getting reports from colleagues and friends in Haryana, Rajasthan, this is what's happening, that is what's happening, but all of it needs to be put together and documented as part of this effort to find out what's happened in 1 year of the present government's rule. The other, I think, very visible intervention has been, and in many ways this is to some extent new, is how I would say a distortion of history takes place for very immediate political ends. And here I'd like to talk about two or three major interventions. One has been the whole attempt to make Patel into a right-wing communal icon. So much so that we are expected to forget that Patel had anything to do with the Congress party. Though that's the only party with, with which he had anything to do throughout his life. We are supposed to forget that he was a very close lieutenant, follower, admirer of Mahatma Gandhi. And we are supposed to forget his entire life and start to believe that he was a possible and a much better substitute for Nehru, and that India's great tragedy was that Patel did not become the Prime Minister after independence, which was his rightful due, and Nehru somehow pushed him aside and became the Prime Minister with obviously disastrous consequences. As you know, there's one name that Mr. Modi does not like at all. When he listed India's Prime Ministers from his famous speech on 15th August from the Red Fort, one name he could not bring himself to utter was that of Jawaharlal Nehru. He's obviously more than just a normal dislike or rivalry maybe. Sometimes you feel the way he's trotting around the world, there's obviously an attempt to assume a Nehruvian kind of persona. And everywhere he goes, he tries to say that, I'm setting right all that has been wrong on behalf of Indian foreign policy these last so many years. The abolition of the Planning Commission, I think, is very much part of that. There's more to it than just abolishing what may look to him like kind of left-wing institution, though it hasn't been that for some time. But I think there's more to it than that. So here, I think it's important to recognize that Patel was to be built up by distorting history, by amnesia, as the possible rival to Nehru, and thereby undermining the Nehruvian legacy. There are also immediate political gains to be made out of this, because it is perceived that your enemy is the Nehru-Gandhi dynasty, since the Congress in many ways rests on that legacy. So there are more immediate political gains to be also made of it. The other thing, of course, is that despite all of us knowing it and it having been proved beyond doubt that RSS Hindu Mahasabha elements were very much involved in the conspiracy, the assassination of the Mahatma, for good reason, I think quite some time back, the RSS and associated forces decided that they were going to try and link to the Gandhi legacy rather than criticize Gandhi. So it's Nehru who's to be demonized and Gandhi who's to be. That part should be papered over, and it should be projected that in fact they have some similarities with the Gandhian legacy. Very subtle but very clear-cut kind of changes. The other more recent one, which again brings the same phenomenon to light, is how this whole Subhash Bose versus Nehru story is being played out. And again, seems to me very interesting that the timing was perfect. The day Mr. Modi went on his foreign tour to France and Germany and Canada 2 or 3 weeks ago, the story broke. And while he was there, because it was all an anti-Nehru story, and obviously international media would be interested in what's happening in India at that time, and the story died predictably by the end of his tour. In the middle of his tour, he gave a midnight conference where he appointed 5 secretaries to the government of India to go into the issue of declassifying those files. When 2 weeks later, quietly they came to the conclusion that the files could not be declassified. It never became a story, so because it served its purpose. There was a weak attempt 2 days ago when he was in China to again pick up this story. One channel at least started a story saying that there was a war chest of Subhash Bose which has somehow disappeared, and tried to link Nehru with it. suggesting that he'd, even run away with the money or couldn't be bothered at locating it, but it didn't really take off. But what's very fascinating for us as historians is that here again, Nehru and Patel, of course, had differences like everybody else did in the freedom struggle. But their differences of any kind with what the political trend that Mr. Modi represents were far more than with each other. So every difference is picked up and then blown into this huge thing to show that Nehru was, somewhere a villain. And here the same thing was happening with the Bose story. That Bose was left-wing. It's also very interesting how many incompatibles can be digested in this version of history. Bose is to be a hero, Patel is to be a hero. Patel and Bose were far more at loggerheads than Nehru was with either of them. Bose and he even, there was a court case which they fought over the will of Bose's brother, Vittalbhai Patel, and for very long. Patel was the main actor in the taming of Subhash Bose at Tripuri, where Nehru was the person who was trying to do the compromise and the go-between and all that. But these are the very, the whole idea is that the public is stupid, they will not notice these discrepancies, and somehow spread the story that Nehru wasn't such a great guy as we all thought he was. So somehow that legacy is to be weakened, and this is how history is distorted. The second thing that I like to talk about is the institutional story. Predictably, again, the premier institution for historical research, which is the Indian Council for Historical Research, has been under severe attack from almost very shortly after the new government took power. The chairman of the Indian Council for Historical Research, a new man, was appointed, who had been very close to the RSS and its institution, which is rewriting history, Itihas Sankalan Samiti, who had no other distinguishing feature. He was not a recognized scholar. He had no great work or anything of that kind. Slowly, as the council, the life of the council came to an end, new members had been appointed, I think about 20 of them. And apart from one of them, it's very difficult to understand why they've been appointed, because they are not known, recognized, accepted as part of the fraternity of scholars. It's not a question of ideology even that I'm talking about. It's basically at first and foremost even a question of credibility as historians, So I think this, and what is happening is the journal which this body brings out, a very prestigious journal called the Indian Historical Review, the entire advisory council of that journal has been changed. The advisory council consists of a lot of people who are in major institutions all over the world.
It has been disbanded.
It's been disbanded. Irfan Habib, Robillah Thapar, Muzaffar Alam, so many other foreign scholars also, they've been, because they want to obviously change the character of the journal. So it's happening slowly and steadily, because this is the body which gives the fellowships, the research grants, big research projects and all that. So it's happening at the institutional level as well. The other thing that I'd like to just end with is, and I think we need to pay more attention to that, there is an RSS promoted Itihas Sankalan Samiti, about which we know very little. We need to know more. What's the kind of work they're doing? What have they published? It needs to be looked at and analyzed. The Vivekananda International Foundation, the Institute, also has a very elaborate setup, which is looking at history. Again, it's all clouded in a lot of secrecy. We know very little, but we need to know, because it's from these vantage points that the assault is going to come. So we need to know what's being put together. We need to know what the arguments are that are being built up. We need to anticipate and be ready for taking on and not be caught unawares. So I would argue for a lot more work at the level of documentation and finding out and knowing what's happening at the different levels. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mukherjee. I would now request my other distinguished panelist, Professor Amar Farooqui from the Department of History, Delhi University, to address us.
I would like to first begin with a very major departure that was made by this government on the 2nd of October last year.
Yeah.
The decision not to have a formal holiday, particularly for government employees, teachers, university teachers, was a very important step in the direction of dismantling the idea of India that has been prevalent during the freedom struggle and after 1947. Gandhiji's birthday has a certain sanctity as a national holiday. A national holiday itself has a certain sanctity. To declare officially that this is not a day on which people can take a holiday and have to work to clean up roads or their offices, the sentiment seems fine. It seems innocuous, but it is not. Cleaning your office space or taking a broom and cleaning the road is something that nobody would say, is a bad thing to do. But to do this on a day that has a certain sanctity about it as a national holiday and which is associated with the name of Mahatma Gandhi amounts to the denigration of Mahatma Gandhi. And that is precisely the intention of declaring this to be a Swachh Bharat Day. So that, because national days are about national holidays, national days are about what the nation would like to remember and what it thinks is valuable to remember and cherish. Just as Independence Day, Republic Day and Gandhiji's birthday are important days which the nation would like to remember. Swachh Bharat, with its vacuous slogan of cleanliness, is intended to dismantle that idea by denigrating Gandhiji. Gandhiji must be forgotten. And this is about history, the history of the freedom struggle. That history is important because during the course of that struggle, during the course of the anti-colonial struggle, there was also another struggle, a struggle for what kind of India we would like to have. And there were several who had a very different kind of idea about India, an India where there would be one religion, one language, an authorized history, and I'll come to that a little later, where this idea was coming from. And that position was defeated. It was vanquished during the course of the freedom struggle. Hence, the need to kill Gandhiji, who symbolized that position very effectively, and his denigration. And that denigration and the political dispensation which is in power today has a long history of denigrating Gandhiji. So it is not surprising, but this is something that is an assault on history, the history of the freedom struggle. But there is, in this larger story, there are other stories also, smaller incidents also, which have a direct bearing on the history of the discipline of history. One incident which is very well known is the way in which the previous session of the Indian National Science Association in South was hijacked. And this is a very distinguished gathering of scholars. Has a very is a very important occasion when top scientists of the country meet and present their research, and has traditionally always been inaugurated by the Prime Minister. That's the kind of importance that is attached to it. Now that occasion was appropriated to peddle a kind of history which people who are practitioners of the discipline would not regard as history. Now this is about the discipline. I am not concerned with the paper that was presented and was much talked about aeroplanes and in the ancient past and so on. I'm not getting into that at all. I'm not an expert in that, so I don't have the competence to comment on that. But that it was presented to an audience, of course, the history of science is a very specialized discipline, very specialized. But it is not people of that kind who were talking about this. It was people who had nothing to do with the discipline of history or of the history of science who were talking about this. I doubt whether if this kind of paper was presented in the Indian History Congress, which was being held in Delhi almost at the same time, whether it would have been taken seriously at all. It wouldn't even be allowed to be presented for that matter. So this is the kind of indirect way in which, by appropriating other organizations which have enormous prestige. So in fact, history is being distorted by using an organization with an enormous prestige and which is publicly funded without actually speaking to historians who are practitioners of the discipline. This is something which needs to be really taken seriously. The way in which the discipline itself is being sought to be dismantled. Anyone can hold forth on history. It is a little more sinister than that. And how sinister it is can be seen in the murder of Govt Pansare. That is also about history. Of course, he was part of the rationalist movement, which is again something that people who are concerned about secularism, people who are concerned about history, are of course also concerned about rational ideas, and that those ideas should be preserved and there should be space for airing those ideas. But in the case of Govt Pansare, he became a target for an even more specific reason related to history, because he had a particular view of Shivaji. A view that is not acceptable to those who would like to use Shivaji to push their divisive agendas. And hence the need to distort Shivaji's history. And it is for this reason that Govt Pansare ultimately became a target of divisive communal forces. Govt Pansare was not practicing historian, but nevertheless he was much more important than many of us put together, precisely because he had the courage to, as an activist, go into the field and talk about a history. But this is what can happen to historians, and this is what needs to be taken into account when we are talking about the kind of assault that there you have on history as a discipline. Professor Mridula Mukherjee has already referred to what has been happening at the Indian Council of Historical Research, and it is not surprising that this has been one organization that the previous NDA regime as well as this NDA regime has sought to use as a vehicle for promoting its ideas. The speed with which soon after the government took office, a new chairman was installed itself is an indication of the priority that is accorded to an organization like the Indian Council of Indian Council of Historical Research. We also have the way in which the direction in which this organization is moving is obvious from the way in which they the chief editor of the Indian Historical Review, Professor Sabyasachi Bhattacharya, was more or less was pressurized into resigning. The new kind of council that has been constituted, and also the decision to invite people who have very little to do with the discipline of history to deliver its prestigious Foundation Day lecture, a character called David Frawley, who is perhaps a survival of the old hippie days in India. That's what I've been told. Although hippies had a much wider worldview, but this is a character who apparently represents the narrower vision of that culture. What has happened in these last few months is perhaps just a trailer of what is going to come. And perhaps what happened in the previous NDA regime was much more aggressive in terms of, rather than what is being happening now. But I think this long-term agenda is something we need to keep in mind, because we've just seen a trailer of that. Because there is ultimately a particular understanding of the nation. What is the kind of India these people want? This is an India which is not inspired by Indian traditions or Indian culture at all. In fact, the idea of India that they are promoting is an idea which is Western, which was popular in the Germany of the 30s and 40s. That is when the RSS was being built. Those were the ideas these people were incorporating. This is the kind of nation. One religion, one people, one history, one language. That is the idea. Hence, it is fascism. This is an ideology that actually developed in its most virulent form, exclusion of people from the nation in Germany. And that is when in the 20s and 30s, people like Savarkar were writing, people like Munje were getting influenced by fascists, by Mussolini. These were the ideas they were incorporating. It's a Western idea. It has nothing to do with India's past. It has nothing to do with India's culture. It has nothing to do with Indian traditions. It is an idea which promotes fascist traditions in the true sense of the term, because that is where they actually, that is the inheritance, that is the genealogy of this ideology. Thank you.
I'll take on from one of the points that Professor Farooqui made just a few minutes ago. That reminded me of the statement was made by a more responsible person, Murli Manohar Joshi, when he was the HRD minister, who called the left-wing historians as terrorists. It's not just a question of the personnel of the institutions like the ICHR, but more importantly, what exactly have they been saying, talking and writing? Well, I would really take on from the chairman's interview, the chairman who was appointed by this government, when he gave his first interview to the Economic Times in November last. He talked about the Mahabharata and Ramayana as the history. It doesn't come to us as a surprise that one of the earliest decisions that he made was to invite Professor S.N. Balgangadhar to deliver the prestigious 7th Maulana Azad Abul Kalam Azad Memorial Lecture, which took place on 11th November 2014. And the theme of the lecture was, the title of the lecture was, "What do Indians need? A history or the past? A challenge or two to Indian historians." What exactly was he saying there basically amounted to something like this, that when you have texts like Ramayana and Mahabharata, you do not need history. History as a subject, as he called it, is a fetish. That also took me back to some years ago when the NDA government has come under the leadership of Vajpayee. I happened to be present in the library of the ICHR then. One day, some member of the Sangha Parivar came and moved around in the library and then said to the librarian, when you have the Vedas in the library, when you have the Ramayana and the Mahabharata in the library, Why do you need other books on history? Well, that's the kind of vision of history that these forces represent. And I think Professor Farooqui has highlighted the vision of India that history writing in their understanding ought to be developing. And that's exactly the threat that we are confronted with, and the kind of reservations that many of us felt when this government came to power last year was precisely on this count, that the very idea of India, which has survived for thousands of years, is going to be challenged in a big way. And what exactly are the essentials of that? He mentioned about David Frawley. And one of the members of the present day council himself designated him as an unacademic person. But that besides, the lecture that he delivered in March this year, 27th March, was entitled Textual Evidence in the Vedas, Cultural and Historical Implications, where he talks about the necessity of undertaking a new Vedic study of mantric and yogic dimensions of the Vedic knowledge, and also pleaded for what he called new timeline of ancient India. That new timeline of ancient India should be created, in which both the outer evidence and the Vedic literary evidence are adequately considered. This might well be euphemism for what the RSS-inspired people have been saying for decades, that we need to push back the antiquities of the Vedas, take them back to 10,000 BC, 15,000 BC, call them pre-Harappan and so on and so forth. The Aryans were the original residents of these people. They went from India to other parts of the world. The whole world was inhabited by the Hindus and so on and so forth. It is this kind of vision, this kind of chronology that is being sought to be propagated in the present regime. Mythifying history is the essential component of the vision of history writing of such political establishments like the present one, whose DNA resides in the RSS vision of India. Let me give you one example. Narendra Modi made a statement a few days ago, picking up from Buddha's observation, Atta Deepo Bhav. Literally, this 3-word observation of the Buddha means be a lamp unto yourself. And he called it the shortest and the most skillful depiction of the skill of management. This particular interpretation has been taken completely out of context of the original statement. These 3 words constitute the last 3 words of a longish observation of the Buddha, where the essence is on inculcating the spirit of reason, where Buddha addresses his audience to tell them that don't accept anything as the gospel truth, question everything, even the most sacred things are to be questioned. And then he ends up by saying, be a lamp unto yourself. It has nothing to do with management skill, and therein lies the crux of the voice of reason, which is being sought to be demolished in a big way by invoking an idea of India, which is in the direction of, as Amar said, one people, one religion, one culture, and so on and so forth. Taking away the essential component of the idea of India as we have known through the millennia, India of diversities, India of multilingual, multi-religious, multicultural, etc., etc. It is this which I think will remain the major agenda for this particular government. And whenever members of BJP make statement to question the long established tradition of idea of India, Modi doesn't really bother about them. He doesn't take them to task. He keeps silence. We are indeed reminded of, Professor Mukherjee would vouch have that, way back in 1977 also, when the earlier avatar of BJP was in the power. I'm talking about the Janata Sarkar of 1977, when Jaisingh was essential component of that. It broke down on the question of dual membership. Unfortunately, nobody talks about that anymore, and on the contrary, dual membership is being sought to be encouraged in a very formal way. Madhya Pradesh passed the government that even the government bureaucrats can become members of the RSS and so on and so forth. Nobody talks about dual membership as an issue. In fact, most of the BJP MPs take pride in calling themselves that they have been the RSS worker and they'll continue to be so. And it was in 1977 that Nanaji Deshmukh, the veteran of the RSS, took up the cause of history writing and came up with all these ideas which are being implemented in a big way now about the glories of India, the Vedic India, so on and so forth, achievements of sciences and so on and so forth. It may sound ironical, but let me underline one thing, that the manner in which this present government and its cohorts believe in not just distorting what Mridula and Amar have talked about, modern Indian history, but the systematic manner in which they are trying to eliminate the long period of Indian history that we know as the medieval period of Indian history, which they would prefer to call it, in the typical colonial fashion, Muslim period of Indian history. It may sound ironical, and some of these people have been talking about how we should really resist the history writing perpetuated by Christian theologians and so on and so forth. But the fact is that way back in 1882, when Max Muller came out with his short monograph called India, What Can It Teach Us?, which was primarily meant to train the people who were aspiring to become civil servants in India, it was in that particular short book that he talked about the 1000 years of Mohammedan conquerors of India as an inferno. That was his description of the Mohammedan conqueror. And he divided that line. 1000 AD is the divider for him. And from that point till the coming of the English in the 17th century, for him that was a disastrous period. He talked about the atrocities committed by these Mohammedan conquerors and so on and so forth. It is that vision which is an inspiration for the people who are talking about one India, one culture, one people, one religion and so on and so forth. So we must really take stock of some of these things. I'm not getting into the details that most of the historians have been talking about, the kind of textbooks that have been in circulation in various BJP dominated states in the last 30-40 years, Gujarat, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan and so on and so forth. Many of us have written on those things. That need not be the focus of our attention right now. But what all has been said in the last 1 year particularly is in fact trying to strengthen some of the things that have been known to us, the professional historians, for quite some time. And it is time that we really take note of that. I think I would really like to conclude with a small observation which imposes quite some responsibility of the historians themselves, that we the historians cannot allow historical discipline to degenerate to the extent that distinction between myth and history is lost and false history becomes instrumental in promotion of political mythology. Our discipline, the discipline of history, its reason data is faith, is reason, not faith. So we ought to be taking stock of the manner in which history is being sought to be written with faith as the guiding principle, with emotions as the guiding principles, rather than the voice of reason. I would like to thank the organizers for conceiving this session and thank the co-panelists for their wonderful contributions, and thank you all for letting me conduct the session